James. James. James.
Hey, what? Oh,
What?
I didn't hear you come in. How long have you been there for a long time?
Yes, you've got
Sorry,
your earbuds in, and you're listening to something far too loud. You're going to hurt your hearing. I hope you've got a doctor to look at that. Jeez.
It's the noise cancellation. Luckily, I do know a doctor who could look at that, actually. But
I do like the fact that you've got the Bose QC45s. Product placement.
One day the check will arrive from those guys. I was listening to a podcast which is called The Podcast About Podcasts.
Oh, God.
Can you guess what it's about?
Podcasts.
There's interesting. So there are like a number of podcasts about other podcasts. It's good to know your enemy, I think. Did I say enemy? I meant peers.
Yeah.
So there is the podcast about podcasts. There's a podcast which is called Podcast Review. There's one called Podcast Junkies. And I think someone needs to do a podcast that reviews these podcasts that review podcasts so that people know which podcast that reviews podcasts that they should devote their time to.
Meta. Wow.
It reminds when I was like a teenager, I went to an evening of electronic music in Nottingham where I grew up, and I turned up expecting like a rave basically, and someone with turntables and pulsing lights and stuff. But no, it was this really, really kind of quiet, attentive audience. This guy came in and he had 4 tape machines and a bassoon. And a microphone, and he walked onto the stage and he turned on each tape machine one by one, and then he went doot with the bassoon, and it was like and then we had to listen to 8 minutes of echoes of this guy's bassoon, and that was my evening's entertainment. But that's surely what a podcast that reviews podcasts should be like.
Yes,
it's putting podcasts between 2 mirrors and watching them disappear into infinity.
Yeah, it could. It would have saved you a lot of trouble too. Maybe they would have steered you away from that kind of concert. Here's a concert you shouldn't see, or here's a podcast you should listen to because it's just a bassoonist playing to 4 tape recorders.
God, podcasts to avoid. That's a podcast they should be. So, but before we launch our new podcast of podcasts that review podcasts, I thought it might be worthwhile going through what other podcasts we listen to, because I know you listen to other podcasts. There's washing up to be done. You have to listen to a podcast.
Yeah, I do. And a couple of them are. I don't listen to a lot of film-related podcasts. I used to.
That's because you're already on the best one. So, why listen to a pale imitation?
Point well taken. 2 Real Cinema Club, ladies and gentlemen. Look for it. Tell your friends. Recently, I heard I think it was a 4, or it might still be happening, 4 or 6-part series where Malcolm Gladwell on his podcast Revisionist History has been talking about the best scripts that were never made. Screenplays. So they were talking to M. Night Shyamalan.
And we've written a couple of those as well.
Yeah. So talking to various writers, some of them we knew, some of them we didn't know. But it was kind of interesting because I think it was called Development Hell. So it was these projects that started with some interest, even had directors and actors attached, and then were ultimately never made. Surprisingly, or maybe not, Malcolm Gladwell was the first. He had written a screenplay with one of his buddies, so that was the first one in the series. So I guess you know where he was going with this whole idea. But
unlike Malcolm Gladwell to be self-promoting,
I do like his podcast, so that's one that I definitely listen to. And then for entertainment, I actually get a lot of filmmaking stuff from Mark Maron's WTF, which is what the, and then you can figure out what the expletive is. But I usually skip his opening monologues because he does go 15 minutes more or less as a stand-up comedian, and I just get right to the guests. So, but I don't listen to him every week because I really want certain people. He does a long-form interview with one person each week, and normally, if it's someone that I don't want to hear about or don't know very well, I don't listen to it. I choose not to.
So it's not Obama every week on his podcast?
No, oh God, no. He did the one big one with Obama, but he had a podcast with Paul Giamatti right around when the holdovers came out, and it was hilarious. They obviously got along very well, and it was a very, very fun conversation. So usually if he's got a filmmaker, an actor, or writer that I really want to hear about, I will definitely listen, because he does do a nice job of really informally interviewing, but at the same time getting some great stories out of people.
There are 3 movie podcasts that I listen to, and like you, I will generally not listen to every episode. I will either wait until I've seen the relevant film and then listen to it, or I will pick and choose. I listen to the Incomparable, which is like a sort of like a flagship of a series of podcasts run by Jason Snell, who is like a veteran Macintosh journalist, the computer and not the coat.
Yeah.
But they generally only talk about genre-based, quite nerdy films. So it's science fiction or fantasy science fiction. And you can tell that's exactly why I listen to it, because it's right up my street. They also do a podcast about, same people, about the Science Fiction Book Awards. So I use them to find out about reading material. But I go for the ones that are about films and television series. I will listen to episodes of the Ghibliotheque, which is a UK podcast about the films of Studio Ghibli.
Yeah.
And I think they originally set out they were going to do one episode about every one of those films from Studio Ghibli, and then the podcast turned out to be more successful than they expected. They got to the end of all the Studio Ghibli films, and they've had to do podcasts about other films which are a little bit like Studio Ghibli films. So they're now kind of squeezing the rag tighter and tighter and tighter to get more drips out of it. But they have also produced a lavishly illustrated Ghibliotheque book, which I bought for Alice for Christmas the other a year or two ago. So they've expanded out. We should do a Two Real Cinema Club book. It's begging for it. Yeah, we should do. And then my other movie podcast, which is now defunct, is a podcast called 80s All Over. So two writers, Scott Weinberg and Drew McQueenie, decided they would do a podcast where every episode they would write about all of the films that got a theatrical release during a particular month in the 1980s. And they started out chronologically, and they started in January 1980. And they did an episode for, I think, every month until about October 1985. And then they realized they just couldn't face doing any more. Oh. So even though the podcast is called 80s All Over, really it's only early 80s all over. And it's particularly heartbreaking because I was really looking forward to some of those late 80s films, because those are the ones that I remember better.
Yeah, of course.
But nonetheless, very entertaining. And I've discovered a few films that I completely glossed over in the 80s through that podcast. How about non-movie podcasts? What else do you listen to?
I listen to a lot of political podcasts, actually.
Ooh, so tread carefully.
I know. There's the National Public Radio, which we call NPR over here, NPR Politics Show. I listen to the New York Times has a couple, the Daily, which sort of goes into one issue per day, Monday to Friday, about 30 minutes. So that's kind of how I start my day most days. And then Ezra Klein has a podcast. He's a New York Times columnist. So a couple of these are NYT or NPR podcasts. I love something called Pod Save America, which is, I guess they're former Obama employees in the White House when he was president. So they're youngish, maybe in their 40s, and they just really analyze politics 3 times a week. I'm listening to too much politics probably, but very liberal perspective, and I like hearing them. They've got a number of collaborations, and one of which is with Men in Blazers. I love the Men in Blazers. They are a couple English guys who now live here. One's from Liverpool, one's from London, and they just cover the Premier League football, but they also, they're very, very, they're quite political, and they're also quite just funny. They're comics, they're wonderful folks. And so I listen to Men in Blazers, and Men in Blazers did a collaboration with Pod Save America last year called World Corrupt. It was all about the Doha World Cup and how it ended up in Doha. And then they did a second season this year. One guy it's Roger Bennett from Men in Blazers and Tommy Vitor from Pod Save America. And they did this series this year. It's World Corrupt second season on the Saudi Arabia World Cup, which is, I think, 2034, and how that was quite a bit of bribery. So they're really investigating FIFA a lot in all these podcasts, and great collaboration because they're two of my favorite podcasts, and then just two hosts together having a blast. It's very, very funny, but it's also very political and very football-y. So it's my wheelhouse. I love it. So those are...
getting in that wheelhouse.
Yeah. So those are a couple of the other ones that I listen to. What do you have that's like non-movie and... You've got some book stuff too, right?
I have got some book stuff. So there's 2 book podcasts that I listen to. Even I'm embarrassed to say this because I know last week I've let down the Two Real Cinema Club book club so badly. I will usually listen to If Books Could Kill for no other reason than that's such a great title.
Yeah.
Where it's two guys, a lawyer and a comedian, I think, who go through some of the most well-known sort of self-help books and just mercilessly rip them apart. So they will talk about these kind of big airport books that have sold very well. Books like Rich Dad, Poor Dad or Freakonomics. But they will read them with an intelligent, critical eye. Which means it feels like a double win because it's funny, but also it means I get to sneer a little bit at books that I feel superior to.
Yeah,
and you know how I love that emotion. The other book podcast that I commonly listen to is the London Review of Books podcast. I've subscribed to the London Review of Books since the week before my daughter was born, so about 16 years ago. Or in fact, no, it's literally the day before my daughter was born, I think. Or no, the day after, that's it. It was the day after she was born. So she was born just before my birthday. On the birthday that I had, the day after she was born, Rachel bought me a subscription to the London Review of Books, which I've maintained ever since. And wonderful that the London Review of Books is, who has time to read? So I listen to the podcast, where they will often have people who have written articles in the LRB to discuss them. Not uncommonly, John Lanchester, who is Britain's greatest journalist, who is hilarious and insightful simultaneously, will be on the LRB podcast. So those are unmissable.
Excellent.
And then, apart from that, I've got a couple of quickies. Every week I will listen to Hard Fork, which is from that New York Times stable.
Yeah, Hard Fork,
Which is where I pick up my tech and AI news.
Yeah.
I will listen to a BBC podcast, which is called You're Dead to Me, which is presented by Greg Jenner. Last week I mentioned Ghosts, which is the British sitcom. It's a BBC sitcom. That originally was born out of a BBC children's program called Horrible Histories. And Greg Jenner was the official historian of this kind of comical sketch show called Horrible Histories. Now he does a historical podcast where every week they talk about one significant figure from history. And they have a comedian and then they have an expert. And so one person makes gags and the other person actually drops knowledge. Those are always very entertaining. And then the other podcast that I will listen to religiously every week is TCGS, which stands for The Computer Games Show, which is 4 British nerds who talk about computer games for about 2.5 hours. And it's kind of, it's 40% computer games and 60% banter. So I will chuckle through that on my drive to and from work every week. That's what gets me through the traffic.
And that sounds a little bit like my hell, but I mean, sort of driving to work though. So I'm a pedestrian, so I usually just have time for a 10-minute podcast. So that's when I'm listening to the Daily or something like that.
Now that they're currently doing work on the A3, I need the longest podcast I can find to get me through the commute.
I think I've mentioned, I think my favorite podcast, and I'm not sure if it's coming back for another season, but it's Heavyweight. Which is Jonathan Goldstein's podcast. He started at This American Life with Ira Glass. He's Canadian. He's a Montrealer by birthright. He's lived in the States for a while. And it's a podcast about bringing people sort of back together or helping them make contact with, people from their past, or solving problems between people who are no longer communicating. And he inevitably just gets himself involved in the story on a personal level, which is inappropriate. And he's very funny. It's a lovely podcast. It just makes me laugh and cry all the time. And I love that about it. And he went over to Spotify with it after being on, I want to say Gimlet for a while. And now I think they're kind of without a home. So they've had the problem finding a permanent home. But look for Heavyweight. It's Jonathan Goldstein. And even just going back and listening to the 50 or 60 episodes they've already done over the years would be a worthwhile adventure.
Oh, that's good. 50 or 60 episodes. That's a reasonable body of work.
We're well over 100 by now. So
this is episode 110 now. Yes.
Woo.
So if there's heavyweight guys and need any tips, they can come to us.
Yes. Well, I guess we put our headphones back on and ignore each other while we listen.
Well, mine have run out of battery now. We've been talking so long. So we're going to have to go and see the film at this rate.
All right, let's do a movie.
I'm glad you watched all those listen to those political podcasts before we watch Civil War, because I think it's all about to kick off, isn't it? You can tell me what the right thing to think is.
I'm really scared to watch this film, so I'm glad you're by my side.
Yeah, maybe we'll need noise cancelling.